History remembers many kings, but only a few who changed the world forever. He was born in a small kingdom, surrounded by myth, ambition, and prophecy. Before the age of 33, he would shatter the greatest empire on earth and carry his name to the edges of the known world. Was he a god, a conqueror, or a man driven by destiny? This is the story of Alexander the Great, where legend ends and history begins. Chapter 1. Introduction: Myth versus History. Alexander the Great stands as one of history's most captivating figures, a man whose life sits at the crossroads of myth and documented reality. For more than 2,000 years, storytellers, historians, rulers, and philosophers have shaped his image, creating a figure who is both a legendary hero and a deeply human leader. Ancient writers described him as someone favored by the gods, surrounded by prophecies from the moment he was born. His mother, Olympias, claimed he was the son of Zeus, and Alexander never completely denied such stories. These myths strengthened his charisma and helped cement his authority, but beneath them lies the real Alexander, a young Macedonian king driven by ambition, intelligence, and an extraordinary ability to influence people and events. To understand Alexander's rise, it helps to know the world he came from. His homeland, Macedonia, was a rugged kingdom to the north of classical Greece. Unlike the democratic cities of Athens or the disciplined militarism of Sparta, Macedonia was a land of mountains, tribal clans, and powerful aristocratic families. For centuries, Greeks looked down on Macedonians, calling them semi-barbarians. Yet by Alexander's birth in 356 BCE, Macedonia was transforming rapidly. His father, King Philip II, was a brilliant statesman and military reformer who united the various Macedonian tribes and reshaped the kingdom into a rising power. Philip introduced stronger infantry formations, upgraded cavalry units, and established a professional standing army, one that Alexander would later lead to the edges of the known world. But to appreciate the scale of Alexander's achievements, we must compare Macedonia with the vast and wealthy Persian Empire, the superpower of the ancient world. Persia stretched from modern-day Turkey and Egypt through Mesopotamia, Iran, Central Asia, and even into areas touching India. Its kings commanded immense wealth, controlled complex administrative systems, and ruled over millions of subjects belonging to dozens of cultures. For over a century, Persia had dominated the eastern Mediterranean and had invaded Greece multiple times. To the Greeks, Persia represented enormous power, almost too large for any single nation to challenge. This contrast between Macedonia and Persia reveals just how extraordinary Alexander's ambition was. Macedonia was small, with far fewer soldiers, smaller cities, and limited economic resources. Persia, by comparison, was gigantic. Yet Alexander believed not only that he could defeat Persia, but that he could replace the great king and rule the empire himself. This confidence stemmed partly from the environment he grew up in. His father Philip had already laid the foundation by unifying Greece under Macedonian leadership. Alexander inherited not only a strong army, but also a mission, finishing his father's plan to conquer Persia. Separating myth from history becomes especially important when studying Alexander's personality. The myths portray him as destined from birth to rule the world, as a man with supernatural courage and wisdom. However, history shows us a young prince shaped by powerful influences: the harsh warrior culture of Macedonia, the brilliant strategic mind of his father, and the philosophical training he received from Aristotle. This combination produced someone who understood warfare, leadership, and the value of cultural knowledge. The myths may exaggerate his divinity, but the history shows that he did possess extraordinary talents. Understanding geography also helps us follow the journey that shaped his empire. Macedonia sat on the border between the Greek city-states and the northern tribal lands. This gave Macedonians a unique perspective. They adopted Greek culture, language, religion, and military tactics, while maintaining their own strong warrior traditions. When Alexander marched south to secure Greece, and later east to challenge Persia, he was stepping into regions already familiar through trade, diplomacy, and earlier conflict. The Persian Empire, by contrast, was a world unto itself. It contained deserts, fertile river valleys, mountains, and wealthy royal capitals like Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. Its rulers governed through satrapies, provinces controlled by regional governors, and commanded armies drawn from many different ethnic groups. To conquer such a massive realm required not just bravery, but planning, diplomacy, and strategic genius. This introduction, balancing myth and historical reality, and mapping the worlds of Macedonia and Persia, sets the stage for Alexander's remarkable journey. His conquests would reshape cultures, languages, and empires, leaving a legacy that continues to influence the world even today. To follow his path, we begin with the world he inherited, the myths that surrounded him, and the empires that stood before him. Chapter 2. Early Life. Alexander's early life reveals the foundations of the leader he would become. Born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, he grew up inside a royal court where power, danger, and ambition were constant. From a very young age, Alexander showed an intense and restless personality. Ancient sources describe him as highly emotional, fiercely competitive, and deeply curious. He did not simply want to rule, he wanted to be remembered. Stories of heroes captivated him, especially the tale of Achilles, whose pursuit of eternal glory became a model Alexander would follow throughout his life. One of the most famous stories from Alexander's childhood reflects his sharp observation and courage. When he was about 12 years old, his father Philip II attempted to purchase a powerful horse named Bucephalus. The horse was violent and uncontrollable, throwing off every rider. While others saw danger, Alexander noticed something subtle. The horse was frightened of its own shadow. Turning the horse toward the sun, Alexander calmed it and rode it successfully. Philip, astonished, reportedly told his son that Macedonia was too small for him. Whether legendary or not, the story illustrates how Alexander was already seen, bold, intelligent, and capable of seeing what others missed. Alexander's education further shaped his mind and ambitions. Recognizing his son's potential, Philip II hired Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, to tutor him. For several years, Alexander studied under Aristotle at Mysa, away from the distractions of court life. His education was broad and demanding. He learned philosophy, ethics, politics, science, medicine, geography, and literature. Aristotle encouraged him to think logically, to question assumptions, and to understand the natural world. This education was unusual for a future conqueror, but it gave Alexander a rare intellectual depth. One book influenced him more than any other, Homer's Iliad. Alexander saw Achilles not just as a warrior, but as a man who sought honor, loyalty, and lasting fame. Aristotle taught him that greatness required discipline and reason, not just strength. These lessons later influenced Alexander's leadership style. He respected learning, surrounded himself with scholars, and showed curiosity about foreign cultures. Even during military campaigns, he asked questions, studied geography, and collected knowledge wherever he went. Yet no influence was as emotionally powerful as that of his mother, Olympias. She was a strong, passionate, and deeply religious woman from the royal house of Epirus. Olympias believed intensely in fate and divine signs. She often told Alexander that he was the son of Zeus, reinforcing the idea that he was destined for greatness. This belief shaped Alexander's confidence and his sense of being chosen. Whether he fully believed it or used it symbolically, the idea of divine favor stayed with him throughout his life. The relationship between Alexander and Olympias was close, but complex. She loved him fiercely, protected his interests at court, and constantly reminded him of his destiny. At the same time, her intense personality and political involvement created tension. Philip II and Olympias had a troubled marriage, and Alexander grew up witnessing rivalry, suspicion, and court intrigue. These experiences taught him how dangerous power could be, and how quickly loyalty could change. They also made him deeply loyal to those he trusted, and ruthless toward those he believed betrayed him. Alexander's childhood personality, shaped by ambition and sensitivity, combined with Aristotle's intellectual guidance and Olympia's emotional influence, created a unique individual. He was not simply a soldier trained for war, nor merely a philosopher trained for thought. He was both. His early life, explains why he later sought not just conquest, but glory, meaning, and legacy. Understanding these formative years allows us to see Alexander not only as a conqueror, but as a human being driven by ideas, emotion, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. Chapter 3. King at 20. When Alexander became king of Macedonia in 336 BCE, he was only 20 years old, and his position was far from secure. His father, Philip II, had been assassinated suddenly, leaving behind a powerful kingdom, but also many enemies. Across Greece and beyond Macedonia's borders, rivals saw an opportunity. Many believed the young prince would be weak, inexperienced, and easy to overthrow. Rebellions threatened from every direction, and foreign powers waited to see whether Macedonian control would collapse. Alexander, however, acted with astonishing speed and decisiveness, proving almost immediately that he was his father's equal in authority and ambition. His first priority was securing Greece. Philip II had forced the Greek city-states into an alliance known as the Corinthian League, with Macedonia as its leader. After Philip's death, cities such as Athens and Thebes began to question their loyalty. Alexander responded not with hesitation, but with movement. He marched south rapidly with his army, appearing before rebellious cities before they could organize resistance. This display of speed shocked the Greeks. At Corinth, Alexander was confirmed as leader of the League and commander of the planned war against Persia. By combining diplomacy with the clear threat of force, he reasserted Macedonian dominance without fighting major battles. However, peace did not last. While Alexander was campaigning in the north against tribal revolts, Thebes rose in open rebellion, believing rumors that Alexander had been killed. This was a direct challenge to his authority. Alexander reacted immediately, marching his army south with extraordinary speed. When he arrived outside Thebes, he offered the city a chance to surrender. Thebes refused. What followed was one of the most brutal decisions of Alexander's life. The battle for Thebes was fierce but short. Macedonian forces broke through the city's defenses, and Alexander ordered a total destruction of the city. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands were sold into slavery, and Thebes itself was leveled to the ground. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves across the Greek world. Athens, which had been considering rebellion, immediately submitted. Alexander's message was unmistakable. Resistance would be crushed completely. This act has remained one of the most controversial moments of Alexander's career. It revealed a ruthless side to his leadership. Yet strategically, it achieved its goal. Greece was silenced. No city dared to rebel again while Alexander was campaigning abroad. With this single act of terror and authority, he secured his rear and ensured that Macedonia would not face internal collapse during his absence. With Greece under control, Alexander turned his attention to the grand project inherited from his father, the invasion of the Persian Empire. This was not a reckless adventure. Alexander spent months carefully preparing. He reorganized the army, confirmed loyalty among his generals, secured supply lines, and ensured that Macedonia itself would remain stable during his long absence. He left trusted officials in charge of domestic affairs and took hostages from powerful families to prevent rebellion. Alexander also understood the importance of motivation. He presented the Persian campaign as revenge for the ancient Persian invasions of Greece, appealing to Greek pride and shared memory. At the same time, he promised glory, wealth, and honor to his soldiers. Many of his men were veterans of Philip's wars and trusted the Macedonian military system completely. Alexander led from the front, sharing hardships with his troops, reinforcing loyalty through personal example. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia, symbolically casting a spear in the land to claim it as conquered territory. He visited the legendary site of Troy, honoring Achilles and linking himself directly to heroic tradition. This moment marked the true beginning of his transformation, from a young king securing his throne to a conqueror challenging the greatest empire on earth. By the end of this phase, Alexander had achieved something remarkable. At just 20 years old, he had crushed rebellion, terrified Greece into obedience, unified his forces, and launched one of history's boldest military campaigns. His actions as king revealed the core of his character, speed, confidence, strategic intelligence, and an uncompromising will to rule. The stage was now set for his clash with Persia. Chapter 4. Persian Campaign. Alexander's invasion of the Persian Empire began in 334 BCE and immediately tested his leadership and courage. Crossing the Hellespont into Asia Minor, he stepped onto land ruled for centuries by Persian kings. The Persians underestimated him, believing that a young Macedonian could be stopped quickly. Their confidence led to the first major confrontation at the Battle of the Granicus River, where local Persian commanders gathered cavalry and Greek mercenaries to block Alexander's advance. The Granicus was a dangerous battlefield. The Persian forces were positioned on high ground along the riverbank, making a frontal crossing extremely risky. Many of Alexander's officers advised waiting, but Alexander chose boldness. Leading from the front, he charged into the river with his companion cavalry under heavy attack. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Alexander himself was nearly killed in close combat, saved only by the swift action of one of his companions. Eventually, Macedonian discipline and coordination overcame Persian resistance. The victory at Granicus shattered Persian confidence in Asia Minor and opened the region to Alexander's army. Greek cities under Persian control began surrendering, seeing Alexander as both liberator and conqueror. After consolidating his hold on Asia Minor, Alexander pushed south along the eastern Mediterranean coast. His next great test came in 333 BCE at the Battle of Issus, where he faced King Darius III himself. Darius assembled a massive army, far larger than Alexander's, confident that sheer numbers would ensure victory. However, the battlefield worked against him. The narrow plain between mountains and sea prevented the Persians from fully deploying their forces. Alexander recognized this advantage immediately. He arranged his troops carefully, anchoring his flanks and focusing on a decisive strike. At the critical moment, he led a direct charge toward the center of the Persian line, aiming straight at Darius. The sight of Alexander advancing with his elite cavalry caused panic. Darius turned and fled, abandoning his army. Once their king retreated, Persian resistance collapsed. The Battle of Issus was a turning point. Alexander had defeated the great king in open battle, proving that Persian power was not invincible. The aftermath of Issus revealed another side of Alexander's character. In the Persian camp, his soldiers discovered the family of Darius, his mother, wife, and children, who had been left behind during the chaotic retreat. In ancient warfare, such captives were often abused or executed. Alexander chose a different path. He ordered that they be treated with dignity and respect, ensuring their safety and providing them with royal accommodations. When Darius' mother mistakenly bowed before one of Alexander's generals, Alexander gently corrected her, saying she had not been wrong. This man too was Alexander. This act of mercy had deep significance. Politically, it presented Alexander as a legitimate successor rather than a barbarian invader. Culturally, it demonstrated respect for Persian customs and royal honor. Personally, it reflected Alexander's belief that greatness required restraint as well as strength. Darius himself later sent letters offering peace, ransom, and alliance. Alexander refused, believing that nothing less than total victory would secure his destiny. The victories at Granicus and Issus transformed the war. Alexander was no longer merely invading Persia, he was dismantling it. His reputation spread rapidly across the ancient world. Cities surrendered without resistance, and allies flocked to his cause. Soldiers believed they were following a leader favored by fate, one who combined fearless courage with strategic brilliance. By defeating Persian commanders at Granicus, humiliating Darius at Issus, and treating the royal family with honor, Alexander established himself as more than a conqueror. He was positioning himself as the rightful ruler of Asia. These early successes set the stage for the final collapse of the Persian Empire, and confirmed that Alexander's campaign was not a gamble, but a carefully driven quest for absolute power. Chapter 5. Egypt and the God King. After his decisive victories over Persia, Alexander turned south toward Egypt in 332 BCE. Unlike many of the lands he conquered, Egypt did not resist him. The Egyptians had long been under Persian rule, which they viewed as foreign and oppressive. When Alexander arrived, he was welcomed not as an invader, but as a liberator. He entered the country peacefully, respecting local customs and religious traditions. This approach immediately distinguished him from previous conquerors and allowed him to secure Egypt without bloodshed. Alexander understood that ruling Egypt required more than military control. It required religious legitimacy. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was not merely a king, but a divine figure chosen by the gods. To gain acceptance, Alexander presented himself as a traditional pharaoh. He made offerings at temples, honored ancient gods, and participated in local rituals. By doing so, he showed that he was willing to adapt to the beliefs of the people he ruled, rather than forcing Macedonian or Greek customs upon them. The most significant moment of Alexander's time in Egypt came with his journey to the Oracle of Siwa, located deep in the Libyan desert. The oracle was dedicated to Amun, the chief Egyptian god, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. The journey itself was dangerous, involving long travel through harsh desert terrain. When Alexander arrived, the priests greeted him as the son of Amun. What exactly was said inside the temple remains a mystery, but Alexander emerged convinced that the oracle had confirmed his divine status. This recognition had immense symbolic power. To the Egyptians, it legitimized him as a true pharaoh. To Alexander, it reinforced the belief that he was destined for greatness beyond ordinary kingship. This moment marked a turning point in Alexander's self-image. From this point onward, he increasingly accepted divine honors and allowed others to worship him. While this troubled some of his Macedonian companions, who viewed such claims as excessive, Alexander saw divinity as a tool of unity. In a vast empire of many cultures, being seen as godlike allowed him to rule over Greeks, Egyptians, and Asians alike, without belonging to only one tradition. During his stay in Egypt, Alexander also made one of his most enduring contributions, the founding of Alexandria. He personally selected the site on the Mediterranean coast, near the Nile Delta. The location was ideal, perfect for trade, naval power, and communication between Greece, Egypt, and the wider world. Alexander envisioned the city as a center of Greek culture and administration, but also as a meeting place for different civilizations. Although he did not live to see its full development, Alexandria later became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and a symbol of cultural fusion. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander underwent a formal coronation as pharaoh. He adopted Egyptian royal titles and was depicted in traditional pharaonic imagery. This ceremony was not merely symbolic, it integrated him into a lineage thousands of years old. He was now king of Macedonia, leader of the Greeks, and divine ruler of Egypt. No conqueror before him had held such diverse titles with such acceptance. Alexander's time in Egypt was brief, but its impact was enormous. He secured one of the wealthiest regions of the ancient world without battle, strengthened his claim to divine authority, and founded a city that would influence history for centuries. Egypt transformed Alexander from a brilliant general into a god-king, someone who ruled not just through force, but through belief, symbolism, and vision. When he finally left Egypt to pursue the heart of the Persian Empire, he did so with renewed confidence and an expanded sense of destiny. Chapter 6. Final Defeat of Persia. By 331 BCE, the struggle between Alexander and the Persian Empire reached its decisive stage. Although Darius III had already been defeated twice, he was not yet finished. Determined to stop Alexander once and for all, Darius gathered an enormous army drawn from every corner of his empire. The two forces met near the village of Gaugamela, on a wide, open plain chosen by the Persians specifically to favor their numerical superiority, cavalry, and scythed chariots. Darius believed this battlefield would finally crush the Macedonian invader. Alexander faced overwhelming odds, but he relied not on numbers, but on discipline and strategy. Before the battle, he carefully studied the terrain and adjusted his formations to counter Persian advantages. When the fighting began, the Persian army advanced with force, attempting to surround Alexander's smaller army. Alexander responded with a brilliant maneuver, gradually shifting his troops to create a gap in the Persian center. At the decisive moment, he led a focused cavalry charge directly toward Darius. Once again, faced with immediate danger, Darius lost his nerve and fled. His retreat caused panic across the Persian army, and the battle quickly turned into a complete collapse. Gaugamela became one of the most decisive victories in military history, effectively ending Persian resistance. After the victory, Alexander advanced into the heart of the Persian Empire. The ancient city of Babylon opened its gates without a fight. Priests and officials welcomed Alexander as a liberator, offering gifts and pledging loyalty. Alexander respected Babylon's traditions and temples, presenting himself not as a destroyer, but as a legitimate ruler. From there, he marched to Susa, one of Persia's great royal capitals and treasuries. In Susa, Alexander seized vast amounts of gold and silver accumulated over generations. These riches allowed him to pay his troops, reward loyalty, and finance further campaigns. The most symbolic conquest came with the capture of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. Persepolis represented Persian royal power, wealth, and pride. Alexander entered the city as a conqueror and took control of its immense treasures. During celebrations, the royal palace was set on fire. Ancient sources disagree on whether Alexander ordered the burning deliberately as revenge for Persia's destruction of Greek cities, or whether it occurred during drunken festivities. Regardless of intent, the destruction of Persepolis became a powerful symbol, the visible end of the Achaemenid dynasty and centuries of Persian dominance. Meanwhile, Darius III fled eastward, hoping to regroup and raise another army. His authority, however, had collapsed. Persian nobles lost faith in their king, seeing him as weak and incapable of resisting Alexander. One of his own satraps, Bessus, betrayed him. Darius was captured and murdered while fleeing. When Alexander learned of Darius's death, he was reportedly furious, not because he mourned an enemy, but because his rival had been denied a proper defeat. Alexander ordered that Darius be given a royal funeral, honoring him as a king. This act was deeply political. By respecting Darius, Alexander positioned himself as his rightful successor rather than a foreign conqueror. He pursued Bessus relentlessly, captured him, and had him executed for treason. With Darius dead and his betrayers punished, Alexander claimed full legitimacy over the Persian Empire. The final defeat of Persia marked the peak of Alexander's power. In just a few years, he had destroyed the greatest empire the world had known and replaced it with his own authority. Yet this victory also marked a turning point. No enemy remained equal to him, and his ambitions began to extend beyond conquest toward the unknown. The fall of Persia was not just a military triumph. It was the moment Alexander became master of Asia, ruler of lands stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, and one of the most powerful individuals in human history. Chapter 7: Expansion to India. After the fall of the Persian Empire, Alexander did not see his task as complete. Instead of turning back west, he pushed eastward, driven by a desire to reach the edge of the known world. For the Greeks and Macedonians, India represented mystery, lands of immense rivers, dense forests, and powerful kingdoms beyond Persian influence. Beginning in 327 BCE, Alexander led his army into regions unlike any they had encountered before. The campaign would become one of the most physically and psychologically demanding of his career. The march into India was marked by extreme terrain and constant resistance. The army crossed high mountain passes in the Hindu Kush, where cold, narrow paths and lack of supplies exhausted the soldiers. In the lowlands, they faced thick jungles, unfamiliar diseases, and intense monsoon rains. Local tribes resisted fiercely, often retreating into terrain that neutralized Macedonian formations. Many regions rebelled as soon as Alexander passed through them, forcing repeated sieges and brutal counterattacks. The campaign became slower, bloodier, and far more exhausting than earlier victories against Persia. The greatest confrontation of the Indian campaign came in 326 BCE at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, where Alexander faced King Porus, a powerful Indian ruler. Porus commanded a strong army supported by war elephants, terrifying animals unfamiliar to Macedonian troops. The Hydaspes River was swollen by monsoon rains, making a direct crossing impossible. Alexander used deception, repeatedly feigning crossings to confuse Porus. Under cover of a stormy night, he led part of his army upstream and crossed the river at a hidden point. The battle that followed was one of the hardest Alexander ever fought. Porus's elephants caused chaos, trampling soldiers and frightening horses. Despite this, Macedonian discipline held. Alexander adapted quickly, targeting the elephant drivers and isolating the animals. After hours of brutal fighting, Porus was wounded and captured. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "As a king." Impressed by his courage and dignity, Alexander not only restored Porus to his throne, but expanded his territory, making him an ally rather than an enemy. This decision reflected Alexander's growing tendency to rule through cooperation as well as conquest. Despite victory, the campaign was taking a severe toll. The army had been marching and fighting for nearly a decade. Many soldiers were wounded, sick, or exhausted. When Alexander proposed advancing further east toward the Ganges River, his troops finally refused. They had heard reports of vast Indian armies and feared endless war in unfamiliar lands. For the first time, Alexander faced open mutiny. He tried to persuade them, reminding them of past victories and future glory, but the soldiers stood firm. Realizing that forcing them onward would destroy his army, Alexander reluctantly agreed to turn back. This moment marked the furthest extent of his eastward expansion. The return journey proved even more deadly than the advance. Instead of taking a safer northern route, Alexander chose to march part of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest environments in the ancient world. Some historians believe he did this to surpass earlier conquerors or to punish his troops for their refusal to march further. The desert was merciless. Scorching heat, lack of water, sandstorms, and starvation killed thousands. Entire units disappeared beneath the sun and sand. Alexander shared the suffering of his men, refusing special treatment and enduring the same conditions. By the time the survivors reached safety, the losses were devastating. The Gedrosian March became one of the darkest chapters of Alexander's career. It demonstrated both his determination and the dangerous limits of his ambition. The Indian campaign expanded his empire, but at an enormous human cost. It also revealed that even Alexander's will had boundaries, not set by enemies, but by the endurance of his own soldiers. India marked a point where conquest gave way to exhaustion, and the conqueror was forced, for the first time, to turn back. Chapter 8. Final Days. After returning from the long and brutal campaigns in India, Alexander stood at the height of his power. His empire stretched from Greece to the edges of Central Asia, larger than any the world had seen before. Yet his final years were not marked by triumph, but by growing political tension, personal strain, and declining health. The same ambition that had driven him to greatness now created instability within his court and uncertainty about the future of his empire. One major source of tension came from Alexander's changing style of rule. As his empire expanded, he increasingly adopted Persian customs, royal dress, court rituals, and forms of address that emphasized his elevated status. He encouraged the integration of Persian nobles into positions of power and even into the army. To Alexander, this was a practical strategy. Ruling a vast, multicultural empire required unity and shared authority. However, many Macedonian officers deeply resented these changes. They believed Alexander was abandoning Macedonian traditions and placing foreigners above loyal veterans who had fought beside him for years. These tensions occasionally erupted into violence. Several of Alexander's closest companions were executed or punished after accusations of conspiracy or disloyalty. Whether these threats were real or exaggerated by Alexander's growing suspicion remains debated. What is clear is that trust within his inner circle weakened. The bonds that once united king and soldiers began to fray, replacing loyalty with fear and uncertainty. At the same time, Alexander's personal life began to unravel. He had always been known for intense emotions, but in his later years, he increasingly turned to heavy drinking. Banquets became frequent, often lasting all night. Some historians believe this behavior was a response to exhaustion, loneliness, and the psychological toll of years of constant warfare. Others suggest it reflected a growing sense of invincibility. Regardless of the cause, alcohol clearly worsened his physical condition. The most devastating emotional blow came with the death of Hephaestion in 324 BCE. Hephaestion was not only Alexander's closest friend, but also his most trusted companion. His sudden death, possibly from illness, shattered Alexander. He ordered extravagant mourning rituals, executed the physician responsible, and reportedly refused food and sleep for days. From this point onward, many sources describe Alexander as changed, more irritable, more reckless, and less restrained. His grief weakened him both mentally and physically. By 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon, intending to make it the administrative center of his empire and to plan further campaigns, possibly into Arabia. Despite signs of declining health, he continued to attend banquets and drink heavily. After one such gathering, Alexander developed a high fever and severe pain. Over the next several days, his condition worsened rapidly. Ancient accounts describe him becoming progressively weaker, eventually losing the ability to speak. Rumors spread immediately that Alexander had been poisoned, possibly by political rivals fearful of his plans or of his growing power. While poisoning cannot be completely ruled out, most modern historians believe his death was caused by natural illness, such as malaria, typhoid fever, or complications from years of wounds, exhaustion, and alcohol abuse. His body, pushed beyond its limits, finally failed. Alexander died in June 323 BCE at just 32 years old. His death shocked the empire. He left behind no clear successor, only a mentally disabled half-brother and an unborn son. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, Alexander is said to have replied, "To the strongest." Whether legend or truth, these words perfectly captured the chaos that followed. Within months, Alexander's generals turned against one another, plunging the empire into decades of war. The unity he had created through force of will collapsed without him. His final days reveal a tragic truth. Alexander conquered the world, but he could not conquer time, mortality, or the limits of the human body. His death marked not only the end of a man, but the beginning of the fragmentation of the greatest empire of the ancient age. Chapter 9. Legacy and Impact. Alexander the Great died young, but his influence outlived him by centuries. Although his empire collapsed soon after his death, the changes he set in motion reshaped the ancient world permanently. His true legacy lies not in the territory he conquered, but in the cultural, political, and intellectual transformation that followed. The world that emerged after Alexander was deeply interconnected, multilingual, and dynamic, a world historians call the Hellenistic Age. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals, known as the Diadochi, fought bitter wars over control of the empire. Eventually, it fractured into several major Hellenistic kingdoms. The most powerful were the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire stretching from the Middle East to Central Asia, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia and Greece. Although politically divided, these kingdoms shared a common cultural foundation. Greek language, art, architecture, and education spread across regions that had never been Greek before. Cities became centers of learning, trade, and administration, linking East and West in unprecedented ways. One of Alexander's most lasting achievements was the spread of Greek as a common language, or koine. This allowed ideas to travel across vast distances. Science, philosophy, mathematics, and medicine flourished. Institutions such as the Library of Alexandria preserved and expanded human knowledge. At the same time, Greek culture blended with local traditions rather than replacing them. This fusion produced new forms of art, religion, and governance, creating societies that were neither purely Greek nor purely Eastern, but something entirely new. Alexander's influence also deeply shaped Rome. Roman generals and statesmen admired him intensely. Julius Caesar wept upon seeing a statue of Alexander, lamenting that he had achieved nothing comparable at the same age. Roman military strategy drew heavily from Alexander's campaigns, particularly his use of speed, decisive battles, and leadership from the front. Roman emperors modeled their authority on his image, seeing him as the ultimate example of conquest and command. In the Middle East, Alexander's image evolved into legend. Persian and later Islamic traditions portrayed him not merely as a conqueror, but as a wise ruler and explorer. In Islamic literature, he appears as Dhul Qarnayn, a righteous figure who traveled to the ends of the earth. In Central and South Asia, Greek influence reshaped art and culture. The famous Gandhara style of Buddhist art shows clear Greek features, realistic human forms, flowing robes, and sculptural techniques derived from Hellenistic models. This cultural exchange would not have been possible without Alexander's conquests. Alexander also transformed the idea of kingship. Before him, rulers were often local or regional. Alexander envisioned a universal ruler, someone who could govern many peoples under a single authority. He promoted intermarriage, multicultural administration, and religious tolerance. Although his methods were imperfect and often brutal, his vision of a connected world influenced later empires, including Rome and Byzantium. In the modern imagination, Alexander remains one of history's most debated figures. Some view him as a visionary who spread knowledge and unity across cultures. Others see him as a ruthless conqueror whose ambition caused immense suffering. Historians continue to argue over his motives, whether he sought glory, power, unity, or immortality. His life has inspired countless books, films, artworks, and military studies. Even today, his campaigns are taught in military academies around the world. Alexander's enduring power lies in his complexity. He was brilliant yet flawed, idealistic yet violent, visionary yet reckless. He changed the course of history not by accident, but through will, intelligence, and belief in destiny. More than 2,000 years later, his name still symbolizes ambition without limits. His empire vanished, but his impact remains woven into the foundations of the modern world.